ठीक है, इसको बंद करो।
One side of size of your crowd, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go there and start. Okay. Can you hear me? Not deep. Okay. Mike. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So, friends, welcome to our brown bag on why is India struggling with manufacturing competitiveness. Our team, as most of you would know, this particular piece of work where Prerna has been taking the lead, and my partner in crime, TG Srinivasan, Baran Pradhan, who is also working on this, and in future months, we will present some of that other work. But this sort of trade is all, there is all synergies everywhere. So the work that we do on the Trade Sentinel also fertilizes this work. And there, we have our friend Prakar who's here as well. So, okay, let me jump straight into it. So the motivation of this is arising from, at the end of the day, it's from India's, I believe, India's most fundamental constraint, which is, for most fundamental outcome problem, which is lack of good quality jobs, right? So I think it is the number one challenge. So this paper focuses on manufacturing, which is, I still believe, is the most critical sector for good quality job creation. And this particular sector, as we know, has many sectors within it, which are holding back India's deeper trade liberalization, including in the free trade agreements, right? So another a simple fact is that we need to take a greater share of global trade today. And which is coming at the same time as there is a noticeable long-term slowdown in global trade. That's true, at least in terms of, measured goods trade. On services, there are different issues. But again, since we're talking manufacturing, the relevant part is there is a slowdown compared to the previous decade in global trade. But that should not be a cause for discomfort. Yes, in the past, there has been a very close correlation between global trade growth and India's trade growth or export growth, right? But given where we are, given where we aspire to be, we need to go faster than world trade, right? If we are going to get manufacturing jobs. In other words, we need to be increasing our share of manufacturing trade from, whatever the number, 2% or so, 1.8% to, 3-4% at least in the next 5 to 10 years. So this paper is an attempt to reminder to ourselves and to policymakers of the critical issues that are important for manufacturing export growth. And not all the answers, as seems to be today the mantra, not all the answers lie in the PLI scheme. And this is not a PLI discussion, I should hasten to add. So how is this paper going to be different? And then I'll stop. One is that we have a data set which we've created, which we have a bunch of input indicators, which we think are good predictors of competitiveness, right? So they are input, not outcome, but input indicators, which are predictors. So you will see as Prerna does the presentation. What we've chosen very interesting comparators, right? You will see which are those that are expected to be India's biggest competitors in the China +1 quest, right? So we're talking of Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam in particular, and then Indonesia is a bit of a straggler there. But these are so these are expected to be, so within Asia, we're not talking about Mexico, we're not talking of Turkey, but we're keeping it to Asia, right? We also corroborating what we've got from this secondary data analysis with industry consultations, right? With some primary insights, and we're trying to match the two. So we looked at a mix of some upbeat sectors, and we've also looked at some sectors which are more reluctant to embrace competition. And in the set of priorities we lay out, which Prerna will talk about, is what are the priorities to better compete. So it's a very pointed set of conclusions and comparisons. How do you better compete with these 3 or 4 most important competitors that we have identified? By the way, which Nomura Securities has, you may be familiar with the flying geese model. So I think these are the countries which are going to receive the next wave of investment after China, the China +1. And finally, we should also be meeting the smell test or the common sense test. So hopefully what we say to you, it did meet that criterion for us. Hopefully it also meets it for you. So Prerna.
So is the mic working? Yeah. So yeah, thanks Sanjay for setting the context. So we had a few yeah, so just this slide to substantiate what we wanted to say and what Sanjay was saying. This slide shows global share of manufacturing exports country-wise. And a glaring fact here to highlight is that as of 2022, India's share in global manufacturing exports is less than Vietnam's share in global manufacturing exports. And this sets the context, broader context for why we are doing this work, to understand where are we lagging behind. And this is something that Sanjay has already talked about, why this study. So I'll skip this. So the outline to this presentation is, I'll first begin with some key trends on India's trade, followed by the competitiveness index that Sanjay talked about. Then corroborating the index findings with the industry discussion that we carried out. I'll talk about it, and followed by certain goal-oriented policy suggestions. So starting with the key trends. On this particular slide, you'll see two major manufacturing economies, China and Vietnam, and how have they progressed in terms of their export baskets over years. And we can see that as of the latest year, 2022, their export baskets constitute of certain important technology-intensive products like electronics, industrial machinery, and automobiles for China, and industrial machinery and electronics for Vietnam. And one thing to mention here is that these countries, specifically China, they first started with assembly and they moved on to manufacturing these specific items. And Vietnam, as of now, it's still in the assembly stages. One glaring fact that I would like to mention here is that we should see how Vietnam progressed from minerals being the topmost exported item in 2001 to electronics now being the topmost exported item in 2022. And what do we see for India? What we see is that India is still stuck with items like minerals and gems and jewelry. Though it's important to mention that over the last decade, India has also seen some positive signs in the form of certain items like electronics and industrial machinery dominating the export basket. And again, the suggestion and the takeaway here is it's important to enter the global value chains through assembly activities, which was also recognized by the Economic Survey of 2019 that suggested integrating assemble in India for the world into the Make in India policy. A very closely related aspect to this diversification picture that we saw in the last two slides, it's related to India's weak participation in global value chains, which is the fastest growing segment of the world trade. And according to an ADB report, it constitutes around 70% of global exports and services. So if we see India's participation in global value chains using a metric called foreign value added of gross manufacturing exports, which means that how much of inputs a country is using, foreign inputs a country is using for manufacturing. So if we see and just compare two countries, India and Vietnam, in the first graph, we see that India has a low percentage of FVA, which is the extent to which we are using foreign inputs to produce our exports, as compared to Vietnam, which is more than 50%. Again, after the economic budget came last week, we in fact also analyzed the trade chapter there, and we saw that this particular image where we can see again very optimistic signals that our GVC growth has increased over years, but still GVC related trade and conventional trade, that is a traditional trade, there's a huge gap between the two, and there needs to be more efforts to narrow this gap. Now, so what drives GVC participation in general, and why we are not being able to make it in terms of our GVC participation? So this slide tells us that the main indicator, that is import tariffs. India has the highest import tariff across these major competing economies, wherein we have considered Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and China. So we can see tariffs on final goods as well as tariff on intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are very important from a GVC perspective, because to integrate into GVCs, you would want to import more of intermediate goods or goods which are of input in nature. And for that, a lower tariff level would be a good facilitator. So India, among these economies, has the highest and by a huge margin import tariffs, which impedes its participation in global value chains.
Very nice clarification question here. Tariffs on final goods in the first column.
Yeah.
9.5. Yeah. I will. Tariffs on final goods in first column, 9.5.
Right.
Suddenly moves to tariffs on final goods
Yeah.
in 2023 to 17%. So please highlight
Right.
and please
Yeah.
tell why sudden
Right.
increase. And also when you are giving tariffs on intermediate goods for 2021,
Mhm.
the corresponding 2023 is why is it missing if you are giving it for the final
Right,
goods,
right.
And my third point, when the tariffs on finished goods are so high compared to the tariffs on intermediate goods, the effective rate of protection would be even higher on the finished goods.
Right.
So 3 clarifications.
Yes. So, yeah, taking the last one first. So I agree with the effective rate of protection, and that is something that we are arguing. And on tariffs, the first 2 columns, that's why I've given this note below. So what happens is that when we take the data from WITS, it gives us a metric called effectively applied rates that takes into account any preferential rate. So MFN and taking into account any preferential rate. So column 1 and column 3 basically is effectively applied rates, because WITS gives us an option to even select any category of goods, grouped goods like intermediate goods, capital goods. So, due to data limitation, WITS has data till 2021 for tariffs. So first and third column are from WITS, but then to just show everyone the recent trend, we have used WTO profiles for MFN rates, because WTO profiles, they do not give you category wise.
Pointer here was that in the second column also, I read it that
this is MFN. This is MFN.
Yeah. So, I mean, to have like with like, you could
Right.
have given the effective tariff rates, if they are given for final goods, there will also be on the intermediate goods.
No, so that's from WTO, the second column. The first and the third are from WITS, the World Bank database. So they kind of
It's not
categorize.
comparable.
Yeah, it's not
We don't
comparable.
have the like matrix. We just give the second column because it was very recent. So the only pointer is
So initially
that
we
could
had-
have been taken from WITS. That's all.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah. So recognizing the fact that there are other parameters other than tariffs that determine a country's competitiveness, we adopt a modified version of Porter Diamond model, which assesses a country's comparative advantage with respect to other economies. So I'll briefly talk about what this model is about and how have we modified this model. So broadly, this model has 4 pillars that are the corners of this diamond. I'll explain briefly what these pillars are. Factor conditions pillar, which broadly captures the key factors of production like labor, land, technology, and even infrastructure related factors. Then related and supporting industries, so which puts light on certain factors that facilitates upstream and downstream linkages of the production chain. So for example, availability of inputs, connectivity between different production processes, and so on. Then demand conditions. So how do demand conditions, either in domestic economy or in foreign market, it drives and influences the competitiveness of countries. The 4th pillar is the firm strategy, structure, and rivalry pillar, which is broadly to reflect on how domestic competition within an economy influences a firm's competitiveness. But I would like to mention here that because of an appropriate metric that we could not find to give a proxy for domestic competition, we have excluded this pillar for now, because we needed a metric that was not only available for India, but it should have been available for all the countries. So that was the limitation for overall adopting the Porter Diamond model for not only India, but overall 5 global economies. So we have excluded this particular pillar. Then there are 2 pillars in the original Porter Diamond model that are exogenous variables, pillars, but then they affect these existing 4 corners and 4 pillars of a country's competitiveness. So that those are government policies. And second is, there was a pillar called chance, which captures any external event like crisis or wars, and what impact would it have on a country's competitiveness. So we have replaced this pillar chance with a pillar called global trade policy, because in one of the critiques of Porter Diamond model, it is said that the model is very much domestic economy based, and it doesn't have many indicators that would put light on a country's approach towards global economy and global integration. So this in a way gives you what the original Porter Diamond model was, and the yellow highlights tell you that how have we modified this Porter Diamond model.
So just a question. You are zooming away, and for reasons you've given, a really important part of the problem, right? I mean, when you're saying that I'm not looking at the structure.
Right.
Are you sure you don't have data? I mean, it's not so difficult to get global concentration index for various NIC industrial classification codes and so on. Shouldn't be so difficult to get comparative. So that's one part. But I still understand the need for simplification. So that's okay. But do build that in your later work, because this, in a sense, and especially the whole SME problem, is actually linked to this issue here.
Right. So I would just like to mention that we, like, till 2 days back, we had this pillar in the model, but then we were not sure. So for now, we have left it. But yeah, I mean, we would love to hear about it, like any suggestions on this. Yeah, so the data has been gathered for these 5 pillars that I've talked about in the last slide for 5 countries, India, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And Sanjay has mentioned that why, because we have based it on a recent Nomura report, which is based on Asia's flying geese model. And according to that report, most of the relocation of supply chains away from India is going to happen away from China is going to happen in these 5 Asian economies. So these 5 countries have been considered for these 5 pillars. Now, each of the pillar would have certain sub-indicators, like the way we compute indices. So each of the pillar would have sub-indicators that would eventually explain these pillars. So if you can just visualize. So overall, if we sum across all the pillars, there are a total of 35 sub-indicators or sub-components. And 26 of these sub-indicators are from a survey that is carried out by World Bank, which is called World Bank's Enterprises Survey. And rest are from other sources like ILO, WDI, UNIDO, and so on. So I'll just mention about what is World Bank's Enterprises Survey. They conduct firm level survey, which is based on firm size stratification in countries. And one limitation of the survey is that the surveys are conducted in different years in different countries. For example, the data that we have used for this index, the survey in Thailand was conducted in 2016. In Malaysia, it was conducted in 2019, India 2022, and the recent ones were conducted in Indonesia and Vietnam in 2023. And that is also one of the reasons that we had to leave out China, because for China, the latest year of the survey available was 2012, which effectively it was a decade-year gap. So we had to leave out China. But there are certain interesting insights because we still analyze China, which I'll talk about in the findings. So this is a framework. And once we had these indicator values, we standardize these indicator values through a min-max approach so that the scores lie between 0 to 100. And there were certain variables or indicators, like, for example, import tariffs, for which a higher value is not good for competitiveness. So this standardization approach took care of that problem. And then in that case, for example, a value of 0 would mean the highest import tariff. So we call those negative variables in the paper. And then, so once we had these standardized indicators across these pillars, so for each of these pillars, the indicators were average. Simple average was done for these indicators to arrive at the broad 5 pillars for each of the 5 countries. And then for each of these countries, these broad 5 pillars were again averaged, simple average, to arrive at one composite value for a country, which we eventually compared.
Show the 5 pillars once in the previous slide.
Yeah, it'll be better if in the findings slide, because that is the original model. Yeah, so before I go to the findings, I just wanted everyone, I'll not spend much time on these slides, but just wanted everyone to look at the key indicators, subcomponents under these pillars. So there are 5 pillars. So the first is the factor conditions pillar. And these are the indicators that we have incorporated. It ranges from labor availability, labor cost, labor quality, then innovation, and credit availability, electricity availability, water availability, and access to land. Then demand conditions. There are indicators that captures to what extent a firm that was surveyed in the enterprises survey, it exports its sales that it produces, whatever it produces, to what percentage of it exports. So to understand how well are we meeting the foreign demand. And then households' final consumption as an indicator or a proxy for domestic demand conditions. Then for related and supporting industries, we have a logistics performance index by World Bank that captures the connectivity parameters in an economy. And then import tariffs on intermediate goods, because intermediate goods are essential and crucial for manufacturing. So the higher tariffs we have on intermediate goods, it would impede or it would be bad for the competitiveness of that firm. So yeah, sorry, pink means what's happening? Yeah, so pink means these are the negative variables that I was talking about. So if a variable is highlighted pink, that means
Inverse, yeah, the relationship is inverse.
Yeah, then the government policy pillar, which again, mostly it's from the World Bank Enterprises Survey, where firms were asked about various obstacles that they face in terms of regulations. For example, tax rates, tax administration, customs procedure. And then we also added one indicator on MFN tariffs, because it also comes under the ambit of government policy and an important indicator for competitiveness. Then the final pillar that we created in this modified version is the global trade policy pillar, which has 2 indicators. One is whether a country is part of any of these 3 agreements, which is the European Union, RCEP, and TPP. So
maybe I can just say a word on that,
Yeah.
Prerna. So, traditionally when we model FTAs, right? So we talk about, oh, how many FTAs have you signed, right? And basically that tells you very little, because you can have very shallow FTAs, as generally India has tended to do. Or if some of you know SAFTA, the South Asia one, it's not worth the paper it is written on, right? There's so many problems with that agreement. So there are agreements and then there are agreements, right? So I think we hit upon this very interesting way. Look, there are these 3 global mega agreements, which all have very high standards, okay? RCEP, we know India walked out, even though this was, compared to the other 2, a shallow agreement, but still it has disciplines, it has China in it, so you have to respect all of those disciplines. So RCEP is the lowest reach, but India is not there. The EU, it's the gold standard for FTAs, right? If you sign an EU agreement with FTA, it's very deep. They will not make exceptions for you. So far, at least, they haven't done any. And And then the gold standard is the CPTPP. Okay. If you're a member of that, then you are basically, it was originally a US led agreement, and then, Trump walked out of it. But basically, all the chapters were brought into the CPTPP. Well, I think 11 or 12 countries, Britain is the latest entrant, are part of it. So if you are part of these three, and our judgment that these are these are deep agreements, high standard agreements, barring RCEP. RCEP is more a size agreement. It's a very biggest agreement in the world in terms of share of global GDP. So rather than all that fluff about how many FTAs you have signed, these are the core ones. If you are part of these, then you're somewhere. If you're not, then and the very interesting point here is Vietnam is part of all three. Okay. I don't know whether any country is part of all three, any other country is part of all three. So we love this indicator basically.
Okay, so
Vietnam is in EU too.
yeah,
They have
yeah.
signed an
The
EU FTA.
FTA,
Yeah.
FTA, yeah.
No, EU, yeah, obviously we're talking of a bilateral, yeah.
Yeah,
Go back, sorry, because this is in a sense the heart of everything. I know that you wanted to.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide? You're staying away from all outcome related.
Yes,
variables,
yeah.
very,
Yeah,
very- be
yes.
very careful.
Yes.
I mean, I was trying to catch you. on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I was grilled on that by TG
That's-
and
Sharpshooter, yes.
yeah. Okay, so these were the 5 broad pillars with these sub-indicators. So after applying the methodology that I explained in the few slides earlier, so this is what the picture looks like. I'll explain. The lines here are 5 countries: India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And these are the broad 5 pillars. So I'll just take a few seconds on each of the pillars. For example, if we start with factor conditions, so we would see that, in fact, in mostly all the pillars, India is towards the center. So the farther away it is from the exterior of the circumference of the circle, the poorer the performance is. So relatively, we can see that for factor conditions, India is again, it's in the interior. And what drives it is that if we look at the data, it's majorly indicators on innovation, then some indicators on land as a constraint. So these are the major factors or indicators that are driving this trend for India for factor conditions pillar. While it has an advantage and it performs at an average level for labor availability, labor cost, and even skills as per the data. But then these are the factors and conditions that take it away from the other countries. Then for demand conditions, while India has a huge domestic demand, it has not been able to achieve the scale to meet the foreign demand. So as per the data, where I said that we have data on how much, to what extent the firms are exporting their sales. So we are at the lowest there, and that's the reason we are away in the demand conditions pillar. Again, in the related and supporting industries, we have one of the highest tariffs, which determines the availability of imported inputs for our manufacturing. And again, because we have the highest tariffs, again, we are the worst performer there as well. And on government policy, there are some indicators that save us, like firms say that there's better political stability in India as compared to these other countries. And there are certain other factors like tax administration. We are at let's say an average value. But then there are other indicators like customs regulations, tax rates, where we are in the lowest percentiles, and that's the reason we are placed there. And eventually, finally, for global trade policy, because of we have the lowest score on the indicator that Sanjay just explained on whether we are part of any of these agreements with EU, RCEP, TPP. And whereas Vietnam has the highest score because it is the member of all these 3. So yeah, that's the overall picture. But then it'll.
Why does Indonesia, why is it 0 on demand conditions? That's just the way you normalized it, right? I mean, it's just
Yeah.
because it was the minimum. So
Right.
therefore it came in. India had only two variables, so therefore.
Right.
And
There are better values in the next slide if I.
Yeah, I think you should move to the next slide. You'll get a better picture. Yeah.
So this picture, the scores are the composite scores that these countries have, and obviously relative scores. So if we see the leading country here is Malaysia, followed by Vietnam, Thailand, India, and Indonesia. And these stack bars give you how much of the contribution is made by these respective pillars in this overall score. For example, 37, the score of 37 in India is constituted by respectively by these, the value of these pillars.
But each sub pillar is also comparable.
Comparable.
The scores on each sub pillar are also, it's not percentage. These are absolute values, so you can compare.
Yeah.
So the highest, India's highest is the blue one, right? Which is
government policy.
Government policy. But it is still much smaller than the others. Yeah.
I object to the name government policy, the term government policy, because everything is government policy. So it may not be.
Regulations, maybe.
Regulation. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this was the first part of the study where we
You may want to just move on a little bit faster.
Yeah,
because-
I'll just take 5-7 minutes. So where we worked on the secondary data and computed this index. So to corroborate these findings with what the firms and the industries have to say, we conducted industry discussions for 4 sectors: automobiles, apparels, electronics, and pharmaceutical. And the reason why we chose has been explained by Sanjay. And we went to industry organizations and private players. And this is a list of stakeholders that we interacted with. So basically, the idea was to understand their concerns and look for, what are their perspectives on competitiveness, and then align these, what the perspectives we hear from them with, the competitiveness index that we have computed under, maintaining this consistency under the Porter-Diamond framework. So very briefly, these are the key insights for the Porter-Diamond pillars and, all these sectors. So these sectors under these pillars. And in the last column, we kind of check its consistency with our work on the competitiveness index. So I'll just explain each of these pillars for these sectors. For example, when we talk about factor conditions. So the apparel sector, what it had to say was that while India's apparel sector has a comparative advantage in cotton-related apparel, we are still not there in man-made fabric like synthetics. And the reason they feel is that we are not innovating enough in blends, and we do not have the skilled labor to carry out this production. So innovation and skilled labor was one of the things that they highlighted in factor conditions. For automobiles, they said that while as you move up the supply chain, it's a very high technology intensive manufacturing process, but then some of the work at the lower end of the supply chain, like producing molds, is a very labor intensive job, and you require specific skill set to carry that out. And they do face challenges with respect to skilled labor availability. The electronic sector, it didn't mention any challenge that it faces with respect to skilled labor availability, but it's our perception that as electronics would move up the supply chain, they would also feel the skilled labor problem. Pharmaceutical, they do feel the skilled labor problem as they venture into API production. So the takeaway and the priorities from this particular pillar is skilled labor and investments in innovation and technology. And it's perfectly well corroborated with our analysis from the competitiveness index. While it says that skills are at an average level or the 50th percentile, but then the industry discussions highlight it as one of the challenges. For demand conditions, very interestingly, the apparel sector, what came out from the apparel sector discussion was that we are not aligned at all with what the foreign market is demanding. So we are producing cotton related apparel, but then what the foreign market is demanding is more of synthetics like jerseys and pullovers by the US, and we are not aligned. And that is the reason that we are unable to meet or export to the potential. And they also highlighted scale issues, which was similar for the automobile sector and the electronic sector. So the final takeaway and the priority here is that we have to attain scale and we have to diversify to meet what the foreign market is demanding. Its consistency check with the competitiveness index, we see very well that we are not exporting enough to to the foreign market. We are in the percentile which is less than the 10th percentile. And while the domestic demand percentile is in the 100th percentile, we have among the highest domestic, like we are among all these countries, we have the highest domestic demand. But then we have to analyze and understand that despite this high domestic demand, we are unable to meet or achieve the scale that has been brought out by all these sectors to even meet the domestic demand. So scale is an issue despite this domestic demand being there. Now, for supporting industries, consistently across sectors, there was this point of we should have lower duties on the intermediate goods or the inputs. And then importance of integrated parks was also brought out. So you can see on the screen that pharmaceutical sectors talked about bulk drug parks, where you would have everything starting from labs, training centers, manufacturing units, all in one place. And similar suggestions they also came from apparel sector. And if we see its consistency with the competitiveness index, that we actually see that we have on this indicator on tariffs on intermediate goods, we are in the lowest percentile. For LPI, which broadly captures connectivity, we are on the average, like we are in the 50th percentile. But then something like land, access to land, which is very important for setting up these integrated parks. While it was there in the factor conditions, we are showing it here just to highlight that while they demand or they propose in these integrated parks, the most important resource for that is land, is a huge constraint for India. For government policies, most of the sectors talked about GST streamlining and also lowering down custom duties on some of the important intermediate goods. And so, for example, automobile sector, they talked about how the way in which you have to pay this credit related. So it leads to cash flow hindrances. So right now, the process in which GST rates or GST is collected, and at every stage you need to file the GST. So it leads to, specifically for a small player, it leads to cash flow hindrances. So they talked about that. Apparel sector, they talked about possible PLI revision for the apparel sector because they consider that MSME is a major player in this particular sector. And the investment criteria that right now is there in the apparel PLI is too high for these players to claim. So overall, we see that tax rates, if we see its consistency, what we heard from these sectors, if we look at its consistency with the competitiveness index, we see that tax rates are actually in the percentage of firms that look at tax rate as an impediment or as a very big obstacle, they lie in around 20 to 30 percentile. And other problems that the index gives us is that customs and trade regulations and corruption is a problem. Otherwise, on government policy, we are relatively better. On the global trade policy, when we talk to these sectors, so there were different views. For example, apparel sector said that they would want to utilize FTAs, but only for countries with which they don't have, let's say, competition in finished goods, so European Union. And they would be willing to lower down their tariffs only on preferential basis and not on MFN basis. The automobile sector flagged the issue of mutual conformity of standards because the automobile sector is faced with these standards and certification compliances, and it leads to the cost of exports. And the pharmaceutical sector thought and felt that more than import tariffs, they would want to use FTA negotiations for NTM and standard related negotiations. Yeah, and there's no guess that for FTAs, for India, we are in the lowest percentile. While on the quality certifications metric, we are on the 50th percentile, but still, as we heard from these industries, it's an important aspect to be taken care of. How do we ensure that the exporters are able to comply with international standards? So with this work on secondary database competitiveness, index analysis, and corroborating it with the industry discussions, these are some of the targeted policy solutions that we arrive at. So there's a middle column on, so these have been maybe proposed in earlier studies as well. So we are thinking for this section on why has this particular policy solution not worked in the past. So I'll not talk about it just in the interest of time.
Finish, yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, the first policy solution that we would want to talk about is import tariffs. Their goal-oriented solution would be a comprehensive review of the duty structure in India, because let's say if we target a long supply chain and we just reduce the duty on a particular part of that supply chain, there will be opposition on the job loss front from that particular part of the supply chain. So it's a better idea to look at the entire supply chain and have the universal duty reduction. And in that sense, there are certain items that, since the Customs Act, have really high and have not been reduced custom duties. So there should be a comprehensive review of the duty structure. And then we have to focus on the FTAs as a policy tool to diversify our export basket. For technology and innovation, what we propose is that we know that there's lack of spending on R&D by Indian firms. So we propose having or incentivizing innovation and technology upgradation instead of incentivizing sales in government schemes like PLI. For skills, apprenticeship is something that we think is a solution, and for that it's very important to have it's important to strengthen connections between the industry and educational institutions. For industrial parks, so I have already talked about it, that for industrial parks and for wide-ranging industrial parks, which would have let's say testing centers or firms and all of these things, it would be very important to have access to that much amount of land. And land is a problem in India, as the data also shows, and it has come out in our discussions as well. So, and after talking to people, we have realized that these land acquisition is a major challenge. So we propose moving to a model on land leasing. And also these discussions with the industry people and important stakeholders has highlighted that attracting labor to these industrial parks, which are set in the outskirts of the city, is a problem. So solving for labor accommodation would also be a good solution, and that would also lead to coming up of housing projects in the area and revenues for the government. For non-tariff measures, the problem is that many of these measures, so non-tariff measures on the countries to which India exports. So basically, Indian exporters complying to these non-tariff measures. So we have seen that many of these non-tariff measures are not understood well by the industry. And there has been talk even in the government to set up a body or think of a separate entity to deal with these NTMs, because it's a challenging issue. So a separate body to deal with these NTMs issue. And very important is that every firm should have a firm level compliance framework to ensure that it's not the responsibility of the national level government to facilitate this, but then it should be done at the firm level to ensure that we are aligned with international standards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Floor is open. Thank you, Prerna. Yeah.
Did you want to just collect 2-3 questions? And
Sure. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
start with Balti. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the this very extensive work you've done. And I do see that your, that index approach is corroborates some of what you found. But I do have questions about what should I say? It's how, how good this kind of indexing is, because if you look at it, there are two sorts of problems that you have. You've used this min-max approach, or this thing, but there are many indicators where if all the whole sample, or all the countries in your sample converge to in a very close band, then when you use min-max, you overemphasize that particular indicator. And so this just straight adding up things is troubling. And the more indicators you've got, the more troubling it becomes, because it becomes kind of arbitrary. And the other thing is that the weightage you're giving is essentially giving the same weightage to all the pillars, but it's different for different industries. And so I think your survey approach, what you used, is much more effective, and it's much richer in the kind of information you got. And actually, if you look at your recommendations, though you could have got those just from your survey. So I'm wondering, and this, yeah. Anyway, thanks.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, Rajesh second. Yeah, and then.
Prerna, can we go to the key insights part 1? I have 2 observations. I appreciate very good work done, and so key insights, not policies.
Oh, key insights. Okay.
Key insights. Part 1. I have 2 observations, one on automobile, the other on apparel. On apparel, you see that what we have suffered from, if you recall, those who have the memory going back, the agreement to textiles and clothing, where when it was ending, India was celebrating. Now that ATC is ending, we will be doing. So I think the scale has not been built up ever since then, and we cannot compete with gaps and others even today. That's pity. So I hope that thing is there in the thought process, that there was something called ATC, Agreement to Textiles and Clothing, and which has put us on the slow process moving forward. But I am a little concerned about, in the automobile sector, duty increases, high duties in intermediate goods on.
Yes.
I think high duties you should have said on passenger cars. That is 100%.
Right.
Actually, once in a while they say, okay, this year we will make it 60%. The duties on the CKD completely knocked down is 7.5%, I think. So
yeah.
There is a paradox in the passenger car industry, which I have not understood. Maybe you would have talked to them and just
Okay.
these 2.
Rajat, yeah. Karthik, sorry.
Hi. So my question is with regard to the reliance on the World Bank Enterprises Survey. Now, this survey across the countries varies from 2016 to 2023, right? And different countries are across different years. The challenge I think I'm facing in terms of looking at the survey is, can we rely and can we equate the survey similarly across so many years, in terms of a 2016 survey being given the same importance in index for data versus a 2023 survey for another country? Because if you go to the first slide that was there, it shows that in the year 2017 and 2022, manufacturing exports global shares have just tremendously changed between countries, right? And that is the timeline between which we're seeing this shift of surveys. So that means a 5-year gap period can mean so much to a country. So I'm not sure if comparing Thailand, for example, of a 2016 data to India or other countries from 2023 would be a fair concern. The second challenge that I'm probably facing when I'm listening to the presentation is, what is the definition of probably competitiveness? Because as the paper went through, I realized we are measuring competitiveness compared to other countries. as to how our industries are competitive compared to other countries. But there are just so many factors that we are looking at in terms of how we are seeing whether we are compared to other countries or not, that it might not be, I'm not sure if they can be equated similarly without looking at many factors that differ us from that country. I'm not sure if the survey was ever meant for measuring competitiveness. And that was the point of the survey, because they're just two different countries and many different metrics. So I'm not sure if competitiveness can be measured from the survey per se. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So just one question on the custom duties which you mentioned. Did you also come across any specific cases where there's a situation of inverted duty structure, where the inputs you are paying more duty than on the finished products?
Okay.
No, I have
Yeah,
one. Sorry, I missed a very nice presentation. I missed early part of it. Just one clarification. Have you considered that cost of capital and availability of finance when you measure competitiveness? I couldn't get, I'm not sure whether it's covered or not. Because that's a common complaint by any manufacturer that cost of capital in India is very high. They don't get finance from banks and all that. So I'm just want to know whether it has been covered or not.
Yeah,
It has been covered. Okay.
Yeah.
No, but my question is relating to demand conditions. I'm not too sure why demand conditions should matter for competitiveness. If you are competitive, then you will capture demand elsewhere, even if it is not. Take, for example, all East Asian country, China, even earlier Japan. So even if the pie is not expanding, if you are competitive, then you will be able to capture global market share. So why that domestic demand only should matter for competitiveness?
Right. Okay. So last question in this round, then if we have time, we'll come back for a second here.
Hi, thank you, Prerna, for the wonderful presentation. So just in addition to Mr. Maheshwari questions on inverted duty structure. So like when in our research also, when we talk industries like for copper, so the thing is it happens, the inverted duty structure also happens here where under FTAs, finished goods also comes in India at a 0 or near 0 duty rate, where the raw materials or the intermediates like you have discussed comes under a much more higher rate, which kind of disincentivize the processing and the midstream processing sectors because they need the raw materials, ore and concentrates for the processing to do the finished goods. So industries like push, remove the duty structure from the raw materials itself, and also looking at the supply chain, like the one part of, like you in your policy discussion, you have mentioned looking at the FTAs and throughout the supply chain where industries emphasize on to look at the one part of supply chain and do reforms over there. So in your research, have you found anything, any such challenges like this? So yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll come back. Vijay, you want to start by?
Let me take a few questions on the index per se. See, you can always game these indices. If you want to bash up India, you can pick the correct metrics to bash India or promote a country. But I think our approach is that we have to make a start. We have a collection of indicators which are very firm level based. It's not impressionistic, some judgments by some people. These are based on firms, the enterprise survey. Now, as to whether the ranking is sensitive to different sets of indicators, our sense is that Prerna has done some experiments with it. If you drop or add a few questionable indicators, it doesn't seem to matter too much for the ordinal ranking of the countries. That seems to be robust. My suggestion is that we'll put all this data out to you so that we can all play with it and then see whether it makes any difference at all. As for the min-max approach and giving equal weight, this again, you can have multiple ways of throwing yourself at the problem. Whether it makes any difference at the end of the day is the issue. I think what Prerna has followed is a fairly easy to understand approach, which is kind of order preserving comparison of countries. So I like that. We mixed it also with the consultations we have. We compared with that. So I think I'm more or less happy with the methodology. The key advantage compared to the other available competitiveness indices is that this is more grounded in reality. It's also input based, not outcome based, and it's very independent. Not too many judgments involved in this. Therefore, I think the results of this are acceptable. Of course, there can be different perspectives on competitiveness. And the enterprise survey is basically a business environment survey, nothing else. Instead of asking people how is the business environment, we're asking the firms themselves. That's the advantage of the World Bank's enterprise survey, which is comparable across countries and over time. The sample is very, very scientifically designed, so one can mine this for a lot of things. That's what I would like to say on the index composition, whether our results will be sensitive to it.
Yeah. So I'll supplement that with, I think as you said also, the corroboration part is very interesting, right? So, and across years, Karthik, also, I don't think it's, if let's say in other words, if you can't compete with Thailand in 2016, then you have a problem, right? India's 2023 data, we're assuming things have improved, right? Normally, countries improve on all scales, yeah? If you can't compete with, and by the way, we didn't have time. We are short of China in 2012 across most indicators, but very critically for a middle income country on technology, right? It's orders of magnitude different in terms of the R&D as a share of sales or whatever the indicator is. But that is a very, it throws out, and in the paper we will certainly mention that. I wanted to discuss a little bit about the important point raised about demand. I don't know who raised it. Yeah, Neville. So what does demand do, right? You heard there's the India jingoism. We have a very large domestic market. We don't need the world, right? So at the same time, when you start parsing it, you see that, well, what is the size of our middle class? Most optimistic estimates would say 250, 300 million, right? And even those will not have purchasing power at Western levels, right? If you use the simple middle income poverty line, not the deprivation poverty line, but the middle, not the $2.15. If you use $3.65, our poverty rate shoots up to 40%. And if you use the upper middle income poverty line, which we are aspiring to in the next few years, then most of our people are poor. I think the figure, I don't remember, the 70-80% we're talking about, right? So where's the market? We've seen in this sector, right? Electronics, the cell phone guys say, we have no market at home. We can only grow if we export, right? And that's what the numbers are showing. For mobile phones, the growth is completely based. The domestic market is saturated. So growth so if the phone is that, then cars, then whatever, the electronics and so on, it's all going to, if you want growth. So it is a fashionable myth that our domestic market is very large. So the large domestic market gives you scale, yes, for many goods, right? But it also, what it does is there's a double whammy. It does give you a disincentive to export if you're an apparel sector, right? And that's why you want these large tariffs in apparels, even though we're supposed to be competitive, but say we're not going to reduce our apparel tariffs because we want our domestic market to ourselves. So that is a complete disincentive to export because you know that people are growing, gradually. So apparel is a sector which can thrive and grow on the domestic market, right? But at the same time, if we want those good quality labor intensive jobs, that's not going to cut it. The domestic market is not going to cut it, right? So while it can give you scale to begin with, when in sector after sector, if you need growth, if you need labor intensive jobs, then there is no way. China's peak export to trade to GDP ratio was at 64% of GDP. India is happy at cutting off at 56% of GDP. We've started declining after that, right? So 8 percentage points of GDP is not trivial, right? Compared looking at China's GDP and and India's GDP, right? So I think we do need the market, the world market to grow is the overall, I think the overall point.
Yeah. So I would like to take this, like to add to this, the ear problem. So this important insight that we wanted to share, but we could not, was that China in 2012, the percentage of firms that reported that they introduced a new product or a service in the market was 41% as compared to India of 2022, which was 3%. So I mean, even if, like, it's a very important insight that way, that even if we compare countries in different years, but then we would be able to see that where does India of 2022 stand as compared to, let's say, other countries in, maybe earlier years. So that was the first thing. And on the automobile sector, Dr. Chadha, so mostly the discussions that we had, they focused on, how can we improve on manufacturing? But then now, not that, we have, high import duties for the finished products. So the only thing they mentioned is that we do lack scale and productivity to compete with China. And for a basic material like specialty steel, they have to pay high duty like 8 to 12%, which hampers their cost of production. So what they propose is that they would be wanting lower custom duties on intermediate goods, but then they didn't shed any light on why they have high import duties on.
I mean, Rajesh's larger point is, of course, very well taken.
Yeah.
I mean, it is absolutely, I mean, it's a 100% duty is an outlier. And I think India basically uses that as a bargaining chip when it does FTAs. For example, the draft with the UK, you basically say, okay, and even that in a very, very reluctant way, okay, you can take literally, you can import 10,000 automobiles, or you can get off the high-end market, we will give you 1% of the money. It's that kind of approach that I understand that we are following in these negotiations with Western countries, or countries who want the market for, automobiles or wine or apparel, or, things which we have been reluctant to open up. So your point is very well taken. The only thing that with India, because of it has a fiercely competitive domestic market in automobiles, as you know. So it's not a good example for other countries to follow, which I know, for example, Pakistan tries to follow, but the results there are completely crazy. And so it doesn't work if you have a small market and high duties. In India, the domestic market gives consumers, unlike the pre-80s India, it gives consumers, as you know, gives a decent, a very competitive pricing, and now quality is kept. But yeah, if you're looking at global exports again, then we are not there. Where we are a market for particular kind of car, the small car. India is a hub for small cars below 800, 1200 cc, but we are not there when it comes to global exports, or EVs. We are not there at all. Yeah.
So the most important thing is effective rates of production.
Yeah. It's a tough nut. The automobile, it's a very strong lobby, and they of course will claim, they employ millions of people. I think it's a very large number, they say. Navish. So
there was a question on inverted duty structure.
So inverted, yeah. So she'll just answer that, and then we'll come to you and Amshik after that.
Yeah, so for that, not exactly the final goods. Generally, in the sectors that we have seen, final goods, in fact, have high duties as compared to. So government has been reducing, let's say, intermediate goods duties over the last few years. But then it's about, as I said in one of my slides, that it's about the entire supply chain that Taneema also mentioned. That so I'll take an example of the apparel sector. So there's a push, to facilitate man-made fabric-based apparels. That fabrics, because right now we are not innovating enough in fabrics, that let's get the fabrics from other countries and lower down the custom duties. But then the people who are manufacturing the fabric, they would have a problem to that, because the chemicals that they want to produce that fabric are right now taxed at high amount. So yeah, so in that sense, if we look at the supply chain overall, this thing is present, and at least industry and some of the firms are cognizant of this fact. But then that's why we are suggesting that it should be a comprehensive review of the duty structure and not just, picking up one part of the supply chain and targeting.
Yeah, that was.
So I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I look at the priorities and then your policy implications, etc. After doing all of this, what is the difference? I mean, this is stuff that we've generally been reading here and there, right? So with all of these methods, new kinds of innovations that you're using, there would be something here which others haven't really got. Otherwise, we are seeing these kind of recommendations here and there. I'd like you to focus on just these two items here, which I myself fairly, I've heard before, generally dissatisfied with. This is that, yeah, we don't have skills or we don't have R&D, right? Why don't you have skilled labor? I mean, I just don't get it. You know, the IT sector grew very rapidly. Okay, in the 80s and 90s, and also in the early 2000s, they never complained of not having enough skilled people, even though no one was being skilled in IT. I mean, they were coming in from different segments, right? So there is something else happening here. Why is there perhaps no supply response coming in if there is indeed demand for skilled labor? So there is something here which I don't think we are being able to capture in these interviews that you're having with industry. I think the same thing applies to R&D in a slightly different manner. So if R&D is important, go ahead, do it. No one's stopping you. You don't necessarily need incentives to go ahead and do R&D, right? I mean, it can be seen just as another expenditure. And there are enough profitable firms around in all of these sectors, right? The reason why I suspect we are not doing R&D is because their market structure is that. So even if there is an innovation, many of these firms will not have the bandwidth to go ahead and introduce those innovations in global markets. Perhaps that is the reason. I don't know. But what I'm saying is you want to go one level deeper than the standard kind of responses that industry.
Right. So, Amshika.
I just wanted to ask, what was the role of clusters? How does manufacturing clusters impact these industries? Because I think manufacturing clusters have an impact on the parallel industries. That's how they survive. And there's a lot of discussion around network theories of, clustering, and they generate economies of scale for all other sort of units, manufacturing units. I'm assuming maybe pharmaceuticals don't survive in such clusters. And you also said that they need special economic zones and stuff. So I think it'll be interesting to see how clusters impact these factor condition, demand condition, and supporting, because I think it's also important to use maybe Vietnam, something which is local, like maybe India survives on clusters. So maybe we should leverage that to sort of. And also I wanted to ask about this capacity utilization indicator. Is it essentially, does it mean efficiency of this? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, last question, then we'll, no? Okay, good. All right, TG, you want to have last few thoughts, then we'll all, each of us.
I would like to reflect a little bit on what Mavisha said. I think we have to identify, by the way, the policy part is pretty nascent. We have not thought about everything. We have to identify what is the market failure. It's not about talking to the industry and just listening to whatever they say. As a group, we have to identify what is the market failure which is not resulting in the outcomes that we want. Now, if we take the innovation research, my feeling is that it's not just a fiscal incentive, which seems to be absent, by the way. It's not just a way of expensing, your research expenses. If you consider countries which have been innovative, if you consider US, for example, like DARPA, and there are government agencies, they are funding people to work, and the results are made public. There is everybody can use those research. So I'm not very clued in on India's research ecosystem. I don't know how far the government is spending money on research and which is made, all the results are not made public in the industrial area, not in other areas. So I'm not sure of that. We have to identify the market failures which do not result in the outcomes that we want. That is my main concern on the research side. And as far as the generic, living in an echo chamber, the conclusion seems to be pretty generic. I think one way we would like to contribute is to go at the sector level and see what exactly is an actionable item, be it tariff or whatever. That is the value added that we bring, not the generic conclusions. Like we have to work on improving the business environment. We have to score better than somebody else. It's not like gaming the index. I think these are the two areas I think we should focus on, if you all agree, on the coming months. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. Yeah, Prerna, anything you want to say on?
Yeah, so on clusters, so yeah, it's an important aspect of manufacturing. So because of the lack of data, comparable data across countries, it has not been included as one of the factors in any of the pillars. But then the industry discussions do bring it out that why integrated manufacturing is important. And yeah, capacity utilization is how well are we utilizing our inputs. So given the output required, how are we utilizing the inputs? So that's one. And yeah, on skills, like we have also talked about it in the past, that what's the problem? But then the interesting thing is that's one of the factors which is different in the secondary data, where it says that we are doing okay on skills, but then when we talk to the industries, depending on which supply part of the supply chain they are operating at, they do flag skill problem constraints. And I ended up talking to better understand this problem to a firm that does this. Like it's an intermediary between firms and labor. So they supply skilled labor to the firms. So they say that migration. So the question was that why cannot companies train, skill the employees themselves? So the problem that they cited is that because there's a lot of migration that happens in employment, in labor. So it's very important. So what they do is that they link and they get the labor from their I just have water. So yeah, so they link, so they bring the labor from their hometowns and supply the labor to the manufacturing firm. So that's one of the constraints that they cited, that because nowadays labor and skilled labor is not available in the particular, let's say, city or the state that you are manufacturing in. So labor availability and skill set availability becomes a problem.
All right. So I thank you for all those comments. So Lavish, on the issue of what are we bringing here? As I tried to explain at the beginning, I think is the process of how we go about it, that corroboration using this World Bank Enterprise Survey, which is an amazing data set, right? So we're getting something which is, I guess, more grounded, less subject to capture. When you do an interview, you can get swayed very much by persuasion, by an argument. So I think it's more grounded. So this cross corroboration was very comforting. So I think, and meeting therefore, and then at the end, smell test, right? So it should make sense, right? And should have been said earlier, in fact. So we take that as a positive thing. But on your two pointed questions, I have a couple of things to say. So on skills, right? So yes, so there is a standard. People say, if you demand, the skills will come, right? So people will have incentives because the pincer regression will say rate of return is higher. Sorry, not Mincer, right? The rate of return is higher, so therefore I will go and train myself. I will learn, right? But what if you have a very basic problem? What if a class 10, 10-year-old person, there's what we call learning poverty. What if a 10-year-old boy or girl cannot read a sentence in English or in Hindi, right? Which is a major problem in our country and South Asian countries. So Even if you want, then you won't be able to get the supply response. And migration is, of course, has been India's way, India and corporates' way to get around that problem. So you bring in people. So we've seen earlier it was the agriculture belt which was drawing the labor, right? The Punjab and Haryanas. Now it's the South which is drawing the migrant labor from all over India, right? Because there's, you know, the 5 states, they are the growth and the prosperity. So they're getting migrant. So we definitely need to make sure that if we want to continue to grow as a country, not as a region, then we need to streamline that migration flow. But for the longer term, obviously, we have to get to basics, right? We have to address the problem of early childhood, you know, the most basic, the ECD, early childhood development issue. So what we propose, and elaborating on what TG said, so economists are not on good ground in the how part. I think we are on much firmer ground in the diagnostic. These are the constraints. This is what is the problem. I think we get into political economy, we get into how do you do it, what has been done. That's a whole exercise in itself. So in fact, what we are proposing is, you know, depending on what you all think, is part 2 of this paper will be a much more detailed look at the identified policy constraints and how do you address them? What's been done? Why hasn't it worked? Where has it been successful in India? Where in the rest of the world? So we're going to, let's say, pick up 5 of the most important constraints and do a deep dive. And I believe, you know, that will be, and we'll have to become political scientists. We'll have to talk to, like I used to do in the World Bank, always talk to our colleagues in particularly in health and education and infrastructure. Without them, it was impossible to do a country macro report. So I think we have to sort of replicate that exercise in the policy part of this paper. I think it requires a really we have to say something which stands, you know, the critiques of the informed people, the sector experts on, say, skill development. Then we have to do a deep dive in that, and probably a collaboration with some of our colleagues in that space. So that is, I think, what we will propose. On R&D, as you know, in my past life, I used to do, that was my living, technology, and you hit it spot on. It's competition. Competition is the critical element for technology development, for the incentive, you know, what they call this famous market structure and innovation. That was the title of, you know, very famous book. And so, yeah, I think we will try to, in line with the original comment, we'll try to find something which is more satisfactory in terms of concentration, you know, a cross-country index. Let's see if we can find something and we can work with. So I think
So
that,
if I can quickly
yeah.
add to that, the bank's enterprise service, they draw the sample from a sampling frame, right? So if you look at the sample distribution across the small, medium, and large, that gives you a sense of concentration. We can do that.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for the feedback. Thank you.
What? Yeah. What happened? I was very much reading last night.